Thank you so much, Danila, and thank you, Jussi, for the great first talk. You already mentioned the weight of history, so it's kind of fitting that I talk as a historian now, and I was really looking forward to this talk today because I'm actually going to wear two hats at the same time in this talk. So I'm going to have my historian's hat on, but I also will always refer to the machine learning or NLU hat at the same time. Machine learning in general and generative AI systems rely on vast amounts of data, as we have heard already. And in the last years, an understanding for the importance of data has grown. And the consensus is now really that we not only need vast amounts of data, but also high quality data. The artifacts, however, that we use and turn into training data for machine learning are produced by humans in their own contexts. They have their very particular meanings and qualities in these certain contexts. What matters is really that we choose the right training data for our purposes. And this means that we need to know our data and that we need to have standards for knowing our data. And yes, this requires lots and lots of work. But I will argue today that it's worth the effort. And I will also argue that it's not a single endeavor, but a joint effort, and that it can be an interdisciplinary effort where we work together. So what I want to do in the next 20 minutes is to take you on my personal journey as a historian through what historians call the sources, or what you might call data. And I will end my talk with a short presentation of a new pilot project at AI Sweden, in which we explore if this interdisciplinary approach is actually scalable and practical. To set the ground, I assume that we all want to build AI systems that are fair and useful, adequately safe and reliable depending on the context. And if they need to be understandable, I think is a question open for debate. For now, let's focus on the fairness part, because this is where trouble begins, as we have seen in the past. Fairness and ethics and justice are not given facts. In every society, the questions of what fairness, what justice, and what ethics are and mean are under constant negotiation. And it's good that it is the way, because societies are in change all the time. We change. So even laws that are written in text are not static artifacts that without tension can be applied to a certain case. Every one of you has been involved in a court case knows this. Even written texts in law need to be interpreted in very concrete situations. As Kate Crawford put it, the problem for computer science is that justice in AI systems will never be something that can be coded or computed. The social world is simply too complex to be processed in ones and zeros. And we have seen that even well-meant efforts to, for example, debias or detoxify systems have had the opposite effects. For example, by silencing minority groups or vulnerable groups that historically have already been silenced. Crawford suggests that we need to address this issue by understanding how AI systems interact with data, with workers, with the environment, and with the individuals whose lives will be affected by its use. These questions are traditionally questions that are explored in other disciplines than the computer sciences. So the good news is, data science, machine learning, AI, you don't need to invent the wheel here. Building safe and fair, useful, maybe understandable AI systems must be, I argue, and can be a joint and interdisciplinary effort in which different disciplines really work together. I think we need to involve disciplines that have standards for thinking about data and data's social, cultural, political, economical, and historical contexts. And we need disciplines that have the tools and methods for studying how technologies and societies and technologies and individuals interact. In my talk today, I will focus solely on the data part and on the question of what historians, or one particular historian, can contribute to understanding the elephant. So what are the questions and standards that a historian can bring to the table? I want to be super concrete and demonstrate to you my own way of asking questions. And the way how I as a historian work with you call data and what I call sources. And I always will try to connect this to the practices of data collection and data curation in the field of machine learning. And to do so, I chose the field that I know absolutely best, and I will draw the examples from my dissertation, Relations of Absence. So historians basically ask, how did we end up here? How can we understand and explain change over time? A historian is not interested in data per se. We are interested in sources that help us answer our research questions. And in my case, my research question was, how can we understand the history of the family in a global context in the 18th century? I know, this might seem completely random, but bear with me. I also promise I will not go into historical details, but I will focus on talking you through the questions that I ask while collecting my data set or the empirical material for my study. So how did I go about? It all starts with asking some basic questions. What sources do I have to answer my question? Why do these sources exist and what are their limitations? How can I mitigate the silences in the archives? And how can I reveal or analyze different voices, different truth, different perspectives? And finally, what are my own biases as a historian when I look for and when I read this data or the sources? All these questions can be translated to the data work within computer science and machine learning. So for example, you can ask which data set and data sources are available for the purpose of my model. Why does this data exist and what are the limitations? How can we fill the gaps in the data set? Where can we find alternative or complementary data sources? And finally, what is my own bias when collecting and curating a data set? Let's be really concrete now. To answer my question, I started looking for sources in German archives. Hello, personal bias. When I say archives, I mean literally physical spaces. I'm an 18th century historian, so I work with unique handwritten sources that exist in one copy and one copy only in one particular place. And in the German archives, I found sources that told the story of global families from a German perspective. Petitions that were sent to the Department of Foreign Affairs. Why do these sources exist? Well, the answer is simple. It's all about state governance and conflicts. Think of the traces that your lives will leave behind and that are likely to survive the next 300 years. Maybe Twitter, however, Twitter might go down the drain and with it all your data. But the fact that you were born and died, that you paid taxes, maybe that one time you sued your neighbor because she took down a tree that you believed was on your property, or maybe the inheritance conflict that you had with your brother over the paternal inheritance. Those are the events that will leave traces in the archives. Why? Because the state has an interest in documenting these events. It's about state governance and having control over the citizens and being able to provide the things that a state has decided to provide to its citizens. In Sweden, these kind of documents become public records and theoretically data for machine learning. Are these records representative of your lives? Well, probably not. They only give snapshots into your life and into your experiences. And these snapshots, and it's really important to remember this, these snapshots are formed after the needs of the state in form and content. The same holds true for the people in the 18th century. The migration of men from Germany into the world caused conflicts that caught the attention of the state. For example, when left behind siblings of the immigrants tried to get a hold of an inheritance in, say, the Indian Ocean world. Of course, the state had an interest in bringing money back home. And therefore, these interests involved the states. These conflicts involved the states. And these conflicts therefore produced paper trails, text and language. that tell us a great deal about the left-behind families, maybe about the migrants themselves, and definitely about the relationship between the state and its citizens. However, these sources do not tell us any details about the new families that emigrants formed, for example, in the Indian Ocean world, simply because these new families were not relevant, they were not of importance to the state. Therefore, we need to look at other archives, and I looked at the archives of the East India trading companies. Even Sweden had one here in Gothenburg. And these archives contain the records of these trading companies. And as a side note, that's important to know, these trading companies were state-like organizations. And they tried to control the people living under their jurisdictions. And part of this control entailed controlling property transactions. Therefore, we today find, for example, wills and testaments in the archives of these companies. Germans who died in the East Indies sometimes made wills to organize their afterlife. And in these wills, these men often gave presents to non-European women. And we know that they are non-European women because they are only mentioned with their first names and with names that are very distinct from other European names. Only from yet other sources and other archives, we know that the same women often actually were the mothers of the children of these men. So the truth here often lies not in one document, in one text alone, but actually in the dialogue between two different archives, between two different documents, between a will and between the account that the executors filed a year later. And sometimes it is even the absence of words that reveals truth. Men who fathered children with enslaved women in the Indian Ocean world often only mentioned the names of their children in their wills, but no mother. On the contrary, the situation for men who father children with European women in the same context, they do mention the names both of their children and of their mothers. So the absence of a mother's name can point towards the presence of a non-European and unfree woman. Why is this important in the context of machine learning and AI? Well, I think it shows that truth and knowledge cannot fully be captured in text. Truth and knowledge can also be found in the absence of text, where we would expect text. And Jussi also said there might be more than language to knowledge, and I think this is also an example. However, even with these methodological tricks that we historians have to kind of still see and reveal there were other people present, we still do not get the full picture of global families in the 18th century. Why? Well, let's think about who makes a will. Usually the better off, who have something to leave behind. So in order to find the voices of, for example, the lower classes, I turn to yet another archive that contains letters. And letters really are a juicy source for historians because they give us glimpses into the personal lives, into the feelings of historical actors. But letters also have problems. So let's think about who has the resources to actually write a letter. In the 18th century, you need paper, you need ink, you need to pay for the transport of a 9-month sea voyage. Not everyone has the resources to write letters. And also, who is important enough that the letters are saved and available to us today? Again, these considerations can be translated into the machine learning world. Take text data that we need for training language models. It's common practice to use text scraped from the internet. And with a historian's lens, we might ask, who has the resources to publish on the internet and on home pages that are likely to be found by scrapebots? Who has the time and the resources and the interest to produce own texts, for example, blogs, that can eventually become training data? Whose voices and perspectives, whose language are we missing if we only use machine-readable texts available on the internet? This brings me to the missing archives that historians also have to deal with. Because the more archives I had pieced together, the clearer it became what was missing. Although we know that these migrants formed families in the Indian Ocean world with non-European, often unfree women, these women are completely absent in the archives that I used. At least their voices, their perspectives, their histories, and their languages. Out of the tens of thousands of pages of text that I looked at during 5 years of intensive research, less than about 10 pages were written by non-European women. And that means that these women only become visible in my empirical material through the lens of European men. And they only become visible either as enslaved household workers or as mothers. But with some common sense, we can assume they were probably friends to someone. They were companions and they were business partners. And here my own bias also comes in, because there might be archives with the sources of these women, but these archives might be unavailable to me, either because I did not get the research grants to travel long times of period to, for example, India, or because these archives are simply not comprehensive to me because I don't speak all the languages. Again, let's connect this to our data collection practices in machine learning. Who's represented in the data that we use, and in which roles are these people represented? From the historian's point of view, it actually matters if someone expresses and represents themselves in a certain role, or if someone is only represented by others. For example, in a will or in the news articles. And we know that this also matters in the field of machine learning, and especially when it comes to generative AI models. So-called biases and generative language models towards certain population groups, we have seen this over and over again, can be traced back to the fact that these groups are overrepresented in certain roles in the training data that was used. And that the texts in which they might become visible in other roles have simply either not been available because of the biases of the person who collected the data, or these texts are not available because of the political, cultural, and historical circumstances. So what is the takeaway from this? Although I have tried to collect sources that allow me to comprehensively answer my question, the resulting material only gives an incomplete picture and glimpses into the truth and lived realities. And this is okay. As I have shown you, the fact that certain voices are absent in the archives actually tells us something about history. There's a reason that we can explain why these women have been written out of the archives. It was in the interest of the colonial state. So how does a historian deal with this? Well, we document and we discuss. We have a standard set of questions for doing so, and this method allows other historians to understand the strength and limitations of our arguments and narratives, and the extent to which the results can be extended and applied to other domains and other times. Again, this can be translated to machine learning, where we more recently have seen calls to document training data so that the users of model can determine the strength and the limitations of the model for their particular use case. It has also been argued that the amounts of data needed for training these models are simply too large to be documented. And here I would say that argument doesn't hold, because documenting some simple questions such as what was collected, internet data or homepage data, when was it collected, who collected it, and why? This is a matter of 10 minutes. The questions that are more comprehensive, such as whose values are represented in the data, whose voices are present, which knowledge do we find in the data? For these questions, we can collaborate with subject matter experts. And this brings me back to the joint interdisciplinary effort and the question of how we at AI Sweden address issues related to representativeness and fairness and ethics related to the training data. If you've listened to Magnus Sagen's keynote earlier this morning, you already know that AI Sweden, together with VASP and RISE, is training GPT-3, the first large-scale generative language models for the Nordics. And the vision is that GPT-3 can become a basic infrastructure for Swedish NLP. And therefore, our ambition is to use training data as representative as possible for the Swedish language and for the Swedish population. And to tackle the challenges of fairness, equality, and ethics in AI development here, we have started a pilot project funded by Vinnova, the Interdisciplinary Expert Pool. The starting point of this project is the insight that we do not need to invent the wheel when it comes to know your data and data collection standards. There are many researchers who have profound knowledge of the artifacts that we turn into training data. Media and communication studies researchers and civil society organizations such as, for example, Internetstiftelsen, have empirical data on who uses the internet and in what ways they use the internet. Gender studies scholars have experience in revealing the power relations that underlie text production and the representation of different people in different genres. Men and women use different forums online. Literary scholars know the traditions of language styles and genres, and historians have standards for data collection, data documentation, and a high sensitivity for how language changes over time. So neither AI Sweden nor any other organization can and should employ all this pool of people in their own teams, but we think a platform approach might be a feasible solution here. So in the Interdisciplinary Expert Pool, we want to establish this platform for knowledge exchange between AI developers and subject matter experts, with the goal to build more inclusive, more representative, and more and fairer AI systems that really benefit everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisca. A really thought-provoking talk. Do we have questions? Okay, I will start. So this might be. Can you spend just a few more words on, the missing archives, those black boxes we saw before? I understand how interesting it is from a historical point of view. What do we do when it becomes training data?
Really good question. So we can take this a step further and look at what the knowledge that was produced in the process of this research. Which parts of that knowledge become potential training data? And if we look at it, so my thesis, for example, is open source, but it's in a PDF. So it would require quite some work to turn it into usable machine learning data. What is available about this topic are shorter abstracts that really simplify the matter. There are 2 articles that I published in German journals where the editors actually cut out the names of the women again because they thought it was too complicated for the German audience. So again, we have erased these names, but those texts are potential training data for machine learning models. And then we have the vast amount of information about these global families from lay and hobby family historians who have lots of time to produce texts about these global families from a very specific German perspective. And again, these hidden stories that can be revealed in the archives are missing in the data that now is available as training data. So I think it's always important that we keep in mind, like, who has the power to produce texts that can become training data, and what kind of archives or what kind of texts are we missing and why?
We have a question. Thank you very much for your answer.
For the wonderful talk and very eye-opening. I have a question which is about, so we have the current state of data. It is very unfair, it's non-ethical. It will take some time until things are fair and ethical. Again, following all the steps that you mentioned. However, we want to train some AI right now. what do we do? Should we put is putting like a disclaimer good enough? Should we regenerate the data? We can do our limited effort to collect or to reduce the biasness in the data, but it will never be fair.
Yeah, great question. So first of all, I think we will never, like, as I said earlier, fairness, ethics, it's something that's constantly changing. There's not an end point. Because the further we get, the more new questions turn up. Things in societies change, and we will rediscuss what does it mean to have ethical AI and so on. And even today, we don't have a consensus on that. But regarding your question, what can we do today? Since there are huge potentials in AI for society, and for competitiveness and everything. We can't stop thinking about these things and building these things, but what we can do is to practice some humility and be humble about the limitations and be transparent about what we actually do and what these systems can be used for. So I think it's really important that that we document, and that we don't need to document, for example, restricted use cases. That can be up to the end user, but we need to be honest about what these systems actually do and what they have been trained on.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could comment a bit about running out of human data. So there's this idea that there's too little data from humans in text that is being produced to catch up with the rate of these models. And moving forward with generative AI, you also have the fun idea of the vast majority of future text data is going to be either completely AI generated or AI assisted.
Yeah.
How would that impact, and how do we make sure that humans are not written out of history, so to say?
Great question. Yeah, so first of all, about the amounts of data, I think this is a good case for thinking about the tensions that happen when technologies and people interact. So right now we assume that the progress is just continuing the way that we imagine it. But if we look historically at the history of technology, we see that societies react differently to new technologies. We just cannot predict right now if these systems that we're building actually will be adapted by societies and people in the ways that we anticipate. Are we running out of data? Will these systems eventually write us out of history? I was recently at the Tate Modern in London, where there's one exhibition about media and communication, and I found it really calming to see that we have thought every time when a new medium was introduced, oh, now people are getting obsolete. We have photography, we don't need artists anymore. And in that exhibition, you really saw, well, people continue producing art. They just start interacting with these new technologies in new ways, and they take inspiration from photography, in the same way as we will take new inspiration now from generative language models, for example. So as a historian, I'm not worried about text production because I think it's deeply human that we tell stories, that we produce texts, because this is what makes us human. So yeah, I think, but we need to think about what happens when we use synthetic data to train these models. I think that's a different question.
Yeah, the kind of one fear with that would be if we, from the set of data produced up until now, we have some biases in the generative model. Some we know, some we might not know, but these biases will kind of be enforced and locked in and then reinforced potentially.
Exactly, and we might not know, like they might take the Me Too debate, like suddenly within only a couple of months, things became unsayable that were sayable before. So these things can rapidly change and add things that we didn't even consider to be a bias before or undesirable. Yeah.
I think we don't have any more time for questions, unfortunately. Thank you very much, Francisca. Actually,
Thank you.